Everyone, good evening, and thank you for joining Alpha Phi Alpha District of Illinois for another session of our fireside chat. I am Brother Dr. Leonard C. McKinnis II, and I have the privilege of serving as the Illinois District Director. Tonight, we are in an extraordinary conversation with members of our fraternity, but also a professor from the University of Illinois who will join us in conversation tonight as we engage in what we know is indeed a most critical conversation facing our society. And that is, of course, the conversation of banned books. I do want to take a point of personal privilege and lift up one of our brothers, Brother Chuck Smoot, who tonight is not well, who would ordinarily be moderating this discussion, but he is not well tonight. And we want to keep him lifted as he goes through his particular health matter. With that being said, I am going to bring our panelists to the stage and give them a moment to introduce themselves. I'm going to start with Brother Dr. Jason Vassar Elon and Brother Drake Mateer, and then Dr. Irvin J. Hunt. Brother Jason, please take it from here and introduce yourself to our audience.
Good evening, everyone. Again, my name is Dr. Jason Vassar Elong. And it's a privilege to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I was initiated out of the Iota Pi chapter at SIU Edwardsville back in spring of '99, and I'm currently active in the Delta Epsilon Lambda chapter. I'm a poet and an anthropologist. I'm a writer myself, and so the issue of banned books and literature is very important to me. So I'm very much looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Brother Elam. 1 second, I'm hearing there is no volume. Could someone in the public sphere who's watching just give us a thumbs up or put in the chat that you can actually hear us? We got a note in the chat that there was no sound from a couple of individuals. Can you all hear us on the live stream tonight? Can you all hear us on the live stream? Oh, thank you, Brother Doss. Thank you for the thumbs up. So with that being said, Brother Dr. Jason Vassar Elong, thank you so much for the introduction. We're going to move to Brother Drake Mateer. Brother Drake Mateer, please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Brother District Director McKinnis, Dr. McKinnis, and thank you for allowing me to be on this esteemed panel with these esteemed brothers here. And so my name is Drake Mateer. I am a Spring 23 brother of Zeta Xi Lambda chapter in Champaign, Illinois. I am a double alumni of the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, with a Bachelor's of Science in Community Health and a Master's of Public Health. And so obviously we are here today to talk about banned books. You know, historically, I'll get a little bit into more of my story of why literature is so important to me. But I've done some work with Freedom Schools, Champaign Freedom Schools. And so one thing that we've always talked about is the importance of culturally relevant literature and pedagogies, that students, you know, young black and brown students can see themselves within the literature and respond to it. And so as we know that there's an onslaught against education, against literature that focuses and centers us, it is essential to have these conversations and, of course, to promote literacy and reading amongst our community. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Brother Drake. And a good friend and colleague, Dr. Irvin J. Hunt, Associate Professor of English and Black Studies at the University of Illinois. Please proceed, Dr. Hunt.
Hello, everybody. Glad to be invited to this event. It's great to see Brother Drake again. I've met you before. I'm an associate professor of English and African American Studies. I focus on social movements, particularly the way literature circulates in a social movement. And I'm currently writing a book on grieving and the language of grief, the language for grief that contemporary poetry offers us.
Thank you so much. So let me frame the conversation a bit and then invite our panelists to engage each other. So again, for those who are joining late, Brother Smoot, as you all know, Chuck Smoot usually moderates these. He texted me a few moments ago and he is unwell tonight. So I will be stepping in and helping to moderate the discussion this evening. So how did this conversation come to fruition? Each year at our district conference, Illinois has a community impact project in which we partner with the local school. This year, We are partnering with the school in East St. Louis, Illinois. And as part of our partnership with this school at our district conference, it is our plan to leave behind banned books and a bookshelf to the school. Banned books will be the theme as we seek to make an impact in the school down in East St. Louis. And it goes without saying that so many of the books that have been banned, particularly in the southern part of this country, are books by Black authors, books by queer authors, books by those who don't usually fit in the sort of matrix, if you will, of a good sort of classical American story. But what we want to do tonight is disrupt that narrative and lift up Black voices and illustrate the ways in which Black literature is not only important to the American story, but it is essential to the American story. And so as we think about this, we are going to ask our viewers tonight at some point to help us leave these banned books at the school with a small donation. We'll let you know how you can do that. We want to leave lots of books at the school in East St. Louis. And the book that we're leaving is low cost. You'll hear more about that as the conversation proceeds. I want to sort of begin tonight with a question about banned books as an idea, right? Banned books as an idea. And the first question, and this can, go to anyone in the panel, or we can take turns sort of, getting at this question. And that is, in the democratic society, what is the function of a banned book, right? And I'm asking that question very intentionally. In the midst of a democratic society, why do we have banned books? What's going on there? Anyone, just feel free to hop in.
Well, if I can say, I believe those books get banned by families who maybe take issue with the subject matter in the books. Say, for example, an educator assigns a book for a class, and the student takes that book home, and the parent sees that book and they have issue with some of the language or some of the content. That can be the reason that a book gets banned. Now, I think the important thing to keep in mind, though, is the content. Some, historically, content is hard history to learn, particularly for students, but it's good history for them to learn if they are to get a nuanced understanding of where they are and how we got to where we are. And so I think a lot of the books get banned because families are uncomfortable with the subject matter. And I think that's where the conversation starts with why a book would be banned in the first place.
Dr. Hunt, you want to hop in there?
Yeah. It's funny. I was looking at some statistics that I thought we could start off with. I was looking at the American Language Association, the American Library Association, and they've been covering this stuff since 1990, the banned books and books that have been asked to be withdrawn. And between 2001 and 2020, on average, they say that 273 individual books have been challenged. And since 2020, or just to actually take last year's number, 2024, 2,452 books have been challenged. That's, the comparison there is stark. And I looked into it a little further, and they were saying that it's actually organizations that are it's organized efforts. And so we typically do think about it as an individual complaint or family's complaint, but recently it has been organized political organizations that have been marshaling these challenges. And so, for me, I think as an African-American literature scholar, I think about the centrality of literacy and reading to Black freedom since we came to these shores. I'm reminded of this quote from basically this Colson Whitehead has a character in one of his books, Underground Railroad, say the only thing more dangerous than a Black man with a gun is a Black man with a book. And so the ways in which there were literacy laws rolled out in Georgia, North Carolina. I remember North Carolina created a literacy law in 1830 that forbade people walking with seditious material, and similarly vaguely defined seditious material, and it was punishable by death. And these literacy laws were rolled out from a black text. David Walker's Appeal to the Colored Slaves of America. And so there has been a concerted, of course, book banning precedes African American literature and has a long history, but I think widely understood is just how dangerous it is for people under constraint to be able to read.
Yeah. This is fascinating. I wanted, Drake, I want to pick up on something that Professor Hunt just mentioned, and I'm sort of thinking about even the study of religion, right? And the way in which reading became weaponized among enslaved Africans, preventing them, in many cases, slave codes from reading the Bible, right? Because of fear of uprisings, right? So there was always this kind of fear. I'm just kind of building upon what Professor Hunt has mentioned, this fear of literacy and the potential for disruption of society, right? Or fear of literacy and disruption of the way things are. What do you see? So it sounds like, even though Professor Hunt mentioned that this idea of banned books precedes Black literature, nonetheless, it seems to me that there is, in fact, a racialized history that runs through this notion of banned books within the context of the American Democratic Project. Drake, how do you read that kind of narrative? Yeah.
So I'm gonna be like my brother, Dr. Hunt, and bring up a statistic.
Yeah.
I believe that 3 weeks ago, the reading and math scores for 12th graders has reached its lowest point in 20 years. And what's interesting is that we're in the midst of book bans, but at the same time, we have witnessed a drastic reduction in literacy and math, regardless if there's book bans or not. And so one thing that I've interested in, I'm taking classes at the UIC as relates to critical pedagogy and urban teacher education. One of the things that we talk about is fugitivity. And so when we think about our ancestors in the midst of struggle, in the midst of course, death, right? The number one thing that was considered a form of what's the word I'm looking for? Going against the system was reading, being educated. And so there is something racialized there, but I also want to bring in a certain analysis as relates to like the Black Scare and the Red Scare. What is some of the information? What are we learning that critiques the status quo? What is some of the information that we are consuming that critiques the state? And so I think, Brother McKinnis, Dr. McKinnis, you brought it up earlier when we had our meeting, we think about empire. Empires ban books. And I think even Kwame Ture put forth, formerly Stokely Carmichael kind of put forth, when certain groups come to power, they ban books because they want their history to be told. And when the other groups come to power, they ban those books as well. And so one thing that's interesting about the present is that the present determines our history. That's another way, an indigenous way of thinking about time. And so who are the winners, right? Who wins? They are able to tell that history. And so we know that there are organizations that are behind this process. And so they're trying to win and tell the story and history that does not adequately address our history. And I think plays a role into some of the anti-intellectualism that has come up recently too. And so I don't want to be too long-winded, but I hope that answers that question.
No, this is good. This is good. And I'm sort of thinking with you all for a moment here. And part of where my thinking is headed now is sort of thinking about the relationship between banned books and the telling of history, or the sort of way in which history is told. And so obviously, when something is banned, right, there is, I'm going to go back to Urban for a minute. There is something that is interpreted as perhaps seditious or dangerous, right? There is something about that which is banned that is seen as a threat to the way things are. So I don't know, brother Dr. Jason, what is it about particularly Black stories, which we want to elevate tonight, that appears dangerous to the American project in democracy, right? And again, I am thinking about what's happening in southern states, the banning of
Mm,
Anti-Racist Baby, the banning of books by Baldwin, the banning of books, The Bluest Eye. There are
mm,
lots of what we would consider in our cultural, form, classics
mhm,
of Black life, classics of Black stories, right? Classical narratives that really dig into the story of Black life that those in the South have now deemed as dangerous to
mm,
the telling of American history, right? So,
mm.
how do you all see the relationship between books, banned books, and the narrative that unfolds about the American way of life?
I think two things, brother. I think, firstly, the act of reading a book is a very intimate experience whereby you can
Mm,
learn about the author's life.
mhm,
So, when you think about writers like Phyllis Wheatley, right, or George Moses Horton, these are people who were enslaved in this country. Think about how many captive Africans, how many of those stories we don't have, those experiences we would never know about. But because Phyllis Wheatley was literate and she could write her story, because George Moses Horton was literate and he can write his story, because Olaudah Equiano could write his story, we can learn about their life on their own terms. No one, um, you think about slave narratives, for example, and people
mhm,
sort of writing, helping these captive Africans write their story, something's missed. But when you
mm,
have someone who can write their own story, and you have someone throughout time pick up that book and read, they can learn from that person directly. And I think what many people don't, what they fear is that the continuity of the communication that you have with an author throughout space and time. For example, one of my favorite writers was Paul Laurence Dunbar,
mm.
right? Paul Laurence Dunbar wrote this poem called Sympathy that references this line, I know why the caged bird sings.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Dr. Maya Angelou was taken by this poem and wrote her whole debut novel based off of this conversation she had, based off of a motif that she only read about from Dunbar. And so that's a conversation that they're having. And
Hmm.
say someone picks up, Dr. Angelou's book, I Know Where the Caged Bird Sings, and then they write a book. Well, then now they're in conversation with Dunbar as well, you know? And I think the danger here is that many people, they don't want that. They would rather people be ignorant and not know versus taking upon themselves
Mhm.
to gain a nuanced understanding of how life is.
Yeah, Drake, part of what I see happening in this moment, right? When I watch Senate subcommittees on banned books and education, right? There's an oft repeated line that is spoken in these circles, and that is we need to tell the truth of American history and not dilute it with these stories about X, Y, and Z. Drake, as you think about empire, which I know that you wrestle with these ideas, what is the story that Southern, and I'm going geographic because this is where we see this
Mhm.
activity unfolding, right? What is the American story that they are hoping that is told, and what is lost in that story by the integration of books like The Color Purple, like The Hate You Give, like The Bluest Eye? How do these stories disrupt the story that they're looking to be told about American history?
I love the geographical analysis, and
Yeah.
so uh, one, we know that the South is where majority of our people still live, even after the Great Migrations. Even though some may call it a refugee crisis, because we were fleeing terror. But kind of with the administration now, a lot of this stuff was going back to states' rights, which was echoed during the Civil War. And so a lot of the discussions about what is the truth and what is the real American story is in reaction to, of course, like Project 16, the 1619 project, in reaction to, I love this brother, Dr. Gerald Horne. I call him probably one of the most esteemed historians with his book, The Counter-Revolution of 1776. And so what we're witnessing, in my opinion, is a cultural war that the current administration and these current reactionary forces are trying to instill and keep up. And so by creating this mythology of civilization versus savage, which is along the color line as well, in order to keep that process going, especially within the South, I think that is to keep that empire going. But at the same time, I'm currently reading a book about the Black Belt thesis, and there's a whole bunch of articles put forth from Harry Haywood and other organizers. When we think about a lot of the organizing during the 30s, where there was Black and white worker solidarity, some of the strongest strikes in Birmingham, Alabama, which brought a lot of those, state actors to heal. And of course, we know about the civil rights movement and whatnot. But in order to not tell that story, to keep that mythology of civilization, this great American project, right? And is that truly a real love for the nation or the empire if you're not rooted in truth? But at the same time, there's a contradiction in this idea of objectivity, because if I'm going to approach something objectively, I'm already coming at it with my own subjectivity. And so, of course, we know that they're trying to ensure that the truth, history is not told in its, I guess, actuality, because they want individuals to still be divided. History shows that there were times of solidarity, there are times of schisms, but then there's also times where, even back then, a book by Dr. Brian Quoba just released about Hubert Harrison, where there's a lot from Hubert Harrison, his critique on the Harlem Renaissance, that was actually left out of Alain Locke's New Negro Movement book. There's a lot of stuff that we don't hear about Hubert Harrison as it relates to the Marcus Garvey and the UNIA movement. And so when we think about what's missed out or what's left out, a lot of times it really is what is antithetical to the state that is left out purposely. Or if it is antithetical, then it is thwarted, it is turned, it is changed, manipulated to ensure the status quo remains the same. And so a lot of the radical, I would say, literature or context is removed. Again, some people say Bluest Eye is very radical given some of its discourse. Of course, when we think about a lot of the queer books and studies that are being banned as well, that's a little bit more radical, that goes against some of the dominant culture of this society. And so I believe that answers that question.
No, it does. It does. It's quite rich as well. Irvin, as I'm sort of thinking about the way that the conversation is unfolding, and I'm wondering if I could sort of pick at your brain here for a moment, given your background as a scholar of African American literature. And again, right, this is, in your discipline, and I'm wondering if there's a way that you can tease out, right? Are there common characteristics of Black literature? Are there themes that emerge? Can you talk about some of those thematic concerns that make their way perhaps into the history of African American literature?
I think there's two fundamental things seem to move through. I think that's a good question. One is, what is the African Americans' relationship to Africa? I think that's pretty much that's on a lot of writers' mind. That seems to be like a pervasive theme. But also, how do we grieve our dead? How do we make space for the ones we've lost? And when I think about your comment on intimacy and the intimacy you would have with another writer, you also are experiencing an intimacy with the people we're commemorating. And what kind of danger do we pose when we can gather all of the wisdom of our ancestors and all the things, when we can retain that and pass that forward? That's the threat of reading. That's the threat of literacy. So it's this relationship to the past that we're constantly working through. And of course, with us, it has a particular salience since we don't even know who we've lost. We've lost. I mean, many millions and more. Isn't that the epigram for Toni Morrison's Beloved, one of the most contested books on in public education, right? I mean, we've lost many millions and more. I mean, and so we don't know their names, and so there's this constant question of how do you grieve not only the droves of people
Mm.
we've lost, but people you don't even know you've lost.
This is and Irvin, and again, because you are really in this space right now, why is grieving such an important theme that emerges in Black literature, in Black life? What is this grieving sense about? Yeah.
I mean, you know, it's like we were born. I mean, the literature seems to be born out of grief. We losing our
Mm,
home,
mm,
losing our language,
mm, mm.
losing our traditions, and then having to cobble that together in community that we're building actually through whether it's an oral tradition or a writing tradition. Um, you know, I think today grief has become such a pressing issue. I know my son is 6 years old, and the poet Elizabeth Alexander talks about her children belonging to what she's calling the Trayvon generation. And what she's saying is that basically a child, let's say a 7-year-old boy, can pick up his phone and tune into Facebook and watch the murder of another man who was once a 7-year-old boy in real time.
Yeah, yeah.
And so you have just the dissemination, just like the it's everywhere. It's everywhere. You have just this, you know, a costing of your public life, your private space with these scenes, the virality of it.
Mhm.
And then, you know, you also have the fact that we are all grieving someone very privately.
Mm.
And the people and those kids we've lost, those were also very private griefs for those families, for those mothers. And so, how do you sort of navigate that intersection of a very public form, a very publicized event, right? That we are, you know, somehow attached to, even when it's not us, in relationship to a very private form of loss. And so there's just this. I mean, we are constantly navigating new ways in which we are watching ourselves go, and also ways in which we have to figure out how to recover from the people that have gone from our lives.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. This is good. You know, panelists, I'm thinking about a conversation that transpired in the U.S. Senate with Ted Cruz, who was he thought he was taking Black authors to task in a public hearing on books in elementary schools. You know, you had all these families in the South, Tennessee, right, Texas, that were storming school board meetings. You all know, you remember this. It was kind of the thing a couple of years ago. It was a big thing. Let's go storm a school board meeting and tell them no more slave narratives, no more, you know, Harriet Tubman. And, you know, parents were going in droves, right, to these school board meetings, knocking down the superintendent's door, demanding that teachers who were teaching this kind of literature be fired from the school. And there's this scene in which Cruz is engaging a Black author, and he's holding up Ibram Kendi's Anti-Racist Baby. And he of course tries to manipulate what the story is really about by suggesting that babies are not racist. So why do we have a book called Anti-Racist Baby? It seems to be, you know, wanting to make white babies and white kids feel bad about their skin color. Now we know that is not only a gross misread of the narrative, but it's an intentional act of manipulation and it's intellectual dishonesty, right? So when we see books like Anti-Racist Baby, like Stamped, you know, another Kendi text that my daughter actually read, what is the point of these kinds of texts, right, that are pushing for anti-racist narratives, that are uncovering the stories of I'm going to go back to something that Irvin mentioned, black bodies under siege and grieving for our bodies. What is so dangerous about these kind of stories to this, if I will, colonial project of education? What is so dangerous about books or ideas like anti-racism, ideas like enslavement, like coloniality?
Mm.
What is it about these ideas that appear to be threatening to the kind of education that we want to perpetuate within our K through 12 system, especially?
If I can, I'd like to start answering this question. So it I also am I'm a professor, and so when students get to college, it's often too late because they've missed so much. I'm sure all of us have been in class and we mention an author or a concept, an idea, and you get the blank face. Like I never knew what that was. What is that? Who is James Baldwin? And then you have to question, okay, how did you get to college without learning about James Baldwin? And so then we have to have a conversation. And so I think books, particularly books like Stamped and others that are geared towards a younger audience, are so important because that's when we ought to start teaching people about the world. They shouldn't start learning about real history when they become adults, because by then they've already formed their own ideas about what's right and wrong. So I'm an anthropologist, and a few years ago we had a conference in Baltimore, and there was a poet there, a white poet. Her name is Sarah Browning, and Sarah gave a poetry reading, and before she did, she said, I'm going to read a poem that talks about my slave owning family.
Mm.
She wrote that she read this poem called "This Is the Poem." That's really about her and a friend who are driving from a concert. But what happens is the poem talks about how they're talking about race, in this poem, and how comfortable they are as friends just unpacking this history, right? You talked about truth earlier. And so in my classes, I'm sure Brother Hunt does this as well, but in my classes, I like to provide nuance. For example, there's the Grimke family who actually owned many captive Africans in South Carolina. Well, Angelina and Sarah said, no, this is wrong. And they moved to Philadelphia. So even a family who owned captive Africans, people in that family who were under that privilege made a decision and said, no, this isn't right. And so I think what a lot of white people have to understand is that a lot of what's happened to us has been public. We've been publicly humiliated. We've been publicly abused in the street. And so a lot of things that happen to us, we have to, with a book, you're sitting in the quiet and you're enjoying this interaction with an author and you're learning about the world. And the danger there, even though it's public, is something that's counter-thematic to what we ought to be doing, right? They expect us to be doing something different than reading a book in public. And so even that is an act of revolutionary. It's a revolutionary act to be a Black person reading in public.
It's fugitive.
It's fugitive because the narrative is such that, that's not something that we do or should be doing.
If I could, I like to veggie back on that. When I was a child, shout out to my mother, Laura Mateer. When I was a child, she instilled reading into me because we all know the saying of, when they're building prisons based off 4th grade reading levels. And so my mother would give me books like Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, Bud Not Buddy, 47, right? Walter Dean Mosley. A lot of these texts, she would make me write book reports on it. And she told me, you may not like me now, but you're going to appreciate it later on. And I do appreciate that. And as my brother was saying, that when you get to college, you realize that a lot of these students don't know something that we feel that you all should have already had this information. So my background was in community health, and I remember we had like the little eye clickers, and I hated those, but that's besides the point. They asked the question, what racial group is primarily on food stamps or, WIC and that help? Yeah. And the majority of the student body, the majority of the class said Black students, Black families, Black people. And I kind of laughed it out, and I was like, everybody got that wrong because numerically we know that there are more white families on food stamp and that type of need assistance. And so talking about that history and engaging that conversation, I don't know, when you brought that up, talking about the history, what's in class and what's not, but then that fugitive act, I attended Mount Carmel High School, and I used to have Black Men Obviously Single Dangerous by Hakeem Mahabuti, The Spook Who Sat by the Door. But in that time, I would have my classmates, white classmates, oh, so you're a spook. I had my books taken, drawn with racial epithets and highly inappropriate stuff in my books because that was viewed as a threat. So it reminded me of being, of our ancestors having to, under the threat of death and whatnot, to try and seek an education. So my fault for that little tangent, but when you brought that up, good brother, I just it spoke to me a little bit.
No, man, we need this because think about, Reverend Meacham. I live in Missouri. I'm from St. Louis, Missouri. And there was a point in time where we had to learn on the river because it was illegal for us to learn how to read and write in Missouri, in St. Louis. And so it's like what I struggle with personally is why more people aren't equally enraged about why we aren't promoting these books. Why are these books banned? Right? I mean, I get that, in some books, like in there may be sexually things that are inappropriate, but they watch TV, they watch movies with their parents, right? And so they're getting the fictionalized a fiction notion of those things, but when it becomes real, I guess we have to have a different conversation, right? We think about the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks. We have to talk about how these Black bodies are just being mutilated. And no one is called to task for that. Right. And so we have to reconcile that within ourselves. Okay. Like all of us on this chat has had something happen to us. And the person who did it, they're out in the world and nothing has happened to them. Right. That has happened to us. And so when we read books like Henrietta Lacks, it strikes a chord, but it's also educational because it teaches us, okay, this is not it's not just me. This has happened to many of us over time. And so, how did she get through? How did her family get through it? How are they getting through it? Right. And that's part of the joy of reading is being in community with other authors and learning from one another on how to deal with the society in which we've been placed.
Yeah. Irvin, I think you were to hop in here.
This tilts it a slightly different direction, but something that keeps coming into mind is how quiet reading is and how the quietest forms of protest were what generated the civil rights movement. Kaepernick, in sort of inheriting that today, the profound power of taking one knee. People were praying at a Woolworth counter, they were just sitting in, they were taking a seat. And so, we think of Black resistance in terms of motion, spectacular acts, building takeovers and everything. And nothing will tell us more about how powerful sitting and being quiet and resting is than folks who are en masse trying to ban it and punish us for it. And so there is something there just in that assumption of the quietude.
There is. I'm going to remind all of us that some of the earliest forms of Black protest rested among enslaved Africans who were reading the Bible and gathering stories of a God who they found to be in contradistinction to the God of the oppressors. It's through reading of, Luke and Exodus where they began to question the American Religious Project and the American Democratic Project, right? And I often remind people the reason why Black folks love the King James Version Bible so much is because it's where many Black folk in enslavement learned how to read, by reading the Bible, taking stories and stealing off, right? Steal away to be with my Lord. And in those moments of stealing away, they were engaging literature. We have about 10 minutes left. I can't believe it. So those in the audience tonight in virtual spaces on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook, listen, Alpha Phi Alpha Illinois is raising funds to support banned books. To support our district conference this year, we are asking you to consider a small donation of $10 to support the banned book project. In a moment, I'm going to put on the screen how you can support this initiative. You can Zelle just $10 to our treasurer to help us purchase these books. In the memo, simply put banned books, and this will be allocated to that project. We will be at Mason Elementary School in East St. Louis in November, where we will leave behind a slew of banned books that tell Black stories, banned books that tells Black stories. And while we're doing that, I want to think about one of these banned books real quick and kind of unravel what might be happening in this particular text that makes it dangerous to our society, right? Now, all of us, I believe all of us have seen, for instance, the color purple, right? And the color purple, I remember watching this as a child, and also the way in which women in my family, right, and friends of mine always found a character in the color purple that they identified with, right? It provided some sense of identity and agency that was filtered through this story. But in some southern states, the color purple is a banned book. It is banned from educational facilities K through 12. What the heck is going on with the color purple that makes this book, and we just have a few minutes, dangerous to the American society? And again, before we get at this, again, please consider supporting our banned book initiative in the District of Illinois with a $10 donation. Treasurer.alphaillinois@gmail.com. Your donation will go toward the purchasing of banned books that we will leave behind at Mason Elementary School in November at our district conference. So yes, what about the color purple is so dangerous that folks want it banned? Anybody, hop in there.
I mean, it's a Black feminist story.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. It's a Black woman's voice. It's a Black woman's voice assuming power, creating relationship. There is something. There's also just this. I think what we always have to remember is how much books that have been banned are portraying life beyond the problems of racism, like portraying Black inner working, internal, riotous flourishing in themselves. And I think that is pretty dangerous when there is a region of Black life that racism has not been able to traduce.
And I think another thing to add to that is the nuance in the different types of Black folks that there are. Because I think there's this idea that all of us are sort of this homogenous type of person. But in color purple, you have different characters. You have variety in who Black people can be. And if they move to the city out of the South, they bring those experiences back with them to the South and say, oh, if you go to Chicago, you're going to experience this. Right? Like in Sinners, for example, the brothers, they go to the big city and they come back like, oh no, it's racist there too. Like they come back with this perspective that they can share with their brothers and sisters in the South. And so I think one of the reasons why the color purple may have been banned is because it provides nuance and complexity in Black life.
I think to veggie back on what the brother said, as you know, I don't eat pork, so I say veggie back. I don't say piggyback. So I don't need it, brother. Go ahead on. So the veggie back, there are some people that would argue that the only way groups or individuals develop is internal. So to understand those internal contradictions within the Black family amongst the Black community, which are highlighted in color purple and in other texts, that gives us, as a community to say, well, let's start thinking about how we move internally, which can then develop us as a people to then withstand what is coming externally, what is out there externally. So
Mhm.
even that kind of that dialectic there of the internal contradictions, if we can figure out some of the, the patriarchy and the hypermasculinity, or and some of the stuff, the homophobia that's within our community, then that we're able to withstand a lot of some of the external, mess that they're throwing at us that we're up against. And so I think that also plays a role into why that story specifically is removed and banned in these contexts.
Yeah, listen, in the last 6 minutes, because one of the highlights of the fireside chat is that we begin and end on time, and we have just 6 minutes left. What I want to do with the 6 minutes is give each of the panelists 1 minute apiece to lift up a Black story that has been impactful in your development as a human, as an intellectual, a Black story, and why that particular Black story was so influential to you and to your development. Let's end with lifting Black stories. Um, let's it doesn't matter who goes first. Drake, you ready? Go forward.
I was about to say that's a difficult story, good brother, but
You
rest
get
her
one,
soul.
Drake. You get one. Yeah.
I will give it because she is with the ancestors now. The autobiography of Sada Shakur. I think that was one of the, most profound autobiographies I've ever read. Uh, I think it tells so much about her story, but again, she talks a lot about the internal contradictions within the Panthers, and so again, having that analysis from a Black woman, an African woman, about the conditions, and she was also very, revolutionary, radical, and so I'm interested to see if there are a lot of banned book talks about her autobiography specifically, or a little bit leaning toward that. But if I were to say the story of Asada Shakur, that autobiography, probably one of the best autobiographies I've ever read. I read Malcolm X's. I love Malcolm X's too, but when I read Asada Shakur's autobiography, I said, "This is the one."
All right, all right. Thank you. Black story. Who's up?
I'd say Beloved. Toni Morrison's Beloved. No book has probably transformed my thinking in life more than that. It ends with, "It was not a story to pass on." It was not a story to pass on. And that double play on pass on is exactly what I think we're talking about. What do we leave behind? What must we take with us? Yeah.
I'm going to go a different direction. I'm a poet. And so for me, I would go with the poet George Moses Horton, who was enslaved in North Carolina on the tobacco plantation, just like my ancestors were. And he was alive around the same time that my ancestors were alive. And so it's quite possible that we saw this man walking around, mumbling to himself, reciting poetry. And so one book I do want to recommend is The Black Poet. It's a piece written by Richard Walser, which goes into the life and times of George Moses Horton.
This is fantastic. I love all of this. I don't know which one, but Baldwin has had such an incredible impact on me, whether it's a letter from a region in my mind, which I have found to be one of, I think, his most influential texts on me and how I think about the world. The way that Baldwin wrestles with ideas in such complex ways and wrestles with what I think are some of the most controversial realities facing the world in which he lived. Baldwin has, for me, this very pointed yet poetic way of talking about the the dangers that face Black life, but also holding his country accountable. And dare I say that he, of course, influenced Ta-Nehisi Coates, right? The way that Coates begins Between the World and Me by suggesting I'm going to hold my country accountable to what my country said on paper. And I think for me, as I think about Black literature and Black stories, in many ways, be it a poet, right? Be it a classical writer, what I see Black writers doing is holding their country accountable to what they said on paper in whatever way they choose to elucidate that narrative. And I think that's the beauty of Black life and the beauty of Black stories. And that's why I think men and our guest tonight, Alpha Phi Alpha, and our guest, Professor Hunt, why we continue and will always lift up these Black stories as we remain true to the mission of our organization. And lest we forget, a literary tradition undergirds Alpha Phi Alpha. So to those in the virtual space tonight, let me thank you for joining us. Please support the Banned Book Drive in Illinois and send a quick donation to our treasurer. $10 will get us a banned book. We will take these books to East St. Louis, Illinois, and leave them at Mason Elementary School. November 13th is the day that we will, the 14th, we'll engage in this activity. So thank you all very much to our panelists. Thank you all. And I want to wish our audience across our various panels from YouTube to LinkedIn to Facebook a very wonderful evening. And thank you for joining us tonight.